Please continue eating, everybody. We're just going to get started here so we have enough time to get through our great event today. Just want to welcome everybody back to the live events at the FCC. It's been a long time, and it's nice to see everybody's faces. I think you all know me. I'm Keith Richburg, the president of the club. And before we get, by the way, I hope you've been enjoying the great photos that have been playing here during the lunch. Those are all taken from the book that we're going to hear more about in just a second here. But just want you to keep an eye on your FCC website for upcoming events, because we are back. We are having events again. And we got a full slate of events coming up, including next week. We're going to have a special a luncheon talk called Covering the War in Ukraine. It's going to be on the 13th of June. With Tom Booth, photojournalist, and Ivan Watson, correspondent from CNN, who are going to be here speaking, along with a special guest, the Ukrainian journalist, who's going to zoom in and join us from the front lines in Ukraine, somebody I met before. So that's going to be a really interesting talk. We've got other great events coming up, and we even are, I think I'm allowed to even hint that we're going to even be able to restart our FCC film series starting later on this month and all of July and all of August. So those of you who don't want to travel outside of Hong Kong because you don't want to worry about flight suspensions and quarantine, stay here because we got a whole good, fun summer of events coming up. And starting today, many of you know Liu Heung Shing, who we call HS, because he's been here before. He was here last time when he spoke about his last book. You had so many books out now. The last one was looking at the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and also the rise of China. But now, after all this time, and all this time we've been enjoying your photographic work, Mr. Liu has put out a memoir. The memoir is entitled The World Is Not Like This, and he's going to tell us why he picked that title in a second. But he was the first, as you might probably already know, he was the first Time magazine photojournalist posted in Beijing since the late 1970s. He was chief photographer for Associated Press, recognized as best photographer in 1989 and 1991. He received Photo of the Year from University of Missouri in '89. He shared the Pulitzer Prize for spot news photography for documenting the collapse of the Soviet Union. His books include, China, Portrait of a Country, China After Mao, Shanghai, Portrait of a City, Road to Revolution, and the book I just mentioned, A Life in a Sea of Red, that was out in 2019. And he's also co-founder of the Shanghai Center for Photography, which I think is still going strong in almost 10 years now.
Close, yeah.
Close to 10 years now. So without further ado, Mr. Liu Heung Shing, thank you very much. And I think we're just going to jump right in with some kind of Q&A. But first of all, why the title, The World Is Not Like This?
The world is not like this because as a journalist, yourself and me with a camera, I think with the advent of the social media versus the traditional media where we have more time to follow a story, and the social media kind of exponentially shortened the time frame where people have to file. And it's not as if the biases or fake story didn't exist before, but they now exist in much greater volume and at a much higher frequency, and lots of perceptions or reporting get shortchanged. And the world is not like this because in my view, at least being in journalism for 45 years, you get to know some of the background of some stories, which difference from the front page headlines that you read, and that's how I decided to use this as a title of this book, and the book. Came about also because of this, the idea that I just enjoyed my 70th birthday last year.
Happy birthday.
And I decided to is a book that worked with a journalist who actually we spent almost a month in my home in Phuket and do the oral history, and then I re-edit his text and so on. So it just came out end of last year with a Hong Kong publisher. And it first came out in Chinese, and I think eventually time to do it in English. I think somehow, doing it in English, actually you have to do it differently because the straight translation sometimes rarely works.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to go back to Phuket and spend more time to do the English version now.
Yes, I haven't been back to Phuket for nearly 2 years now. I really missed it.
Yeah, it's about time to go back. We need the English version. But from what I know, in this version, you actually talk about your whole life and not just the great stories you covered. But you didn't actually start out to be a photographer. You started out to be an artist. Is that right?
Well, I learned about paintings and when I was a teenager in Hong Kong, and after 2-3 years of Saturday going to the classes, learning how to draw, which actually eventually come back and help me in photography with a sense of composition, things like that. But after 2 years of drawing and painting, I realized I just didn't have the talent for it. And then I moved on.
So you just picked up photography then?
I picked up photography thanks to the great American university system that before you graduate, you could take up to 10 credits of anything you want, anything you are curious, and so forth. So I picked a course in photography and study under John Milley, who's this legendary Life magazine photographer. And after graduation, he invited me to work with him as his assistant at Life magazine for almost a year.
That was back here in Hong Kong or in
New York?
In New York.
Right.
Talk about how you then got back to Hong Kong and how you ended up being the photographer, one of the first ones to go into Beijing with the New York Times.
Well, no, Time magazine.
Time magazine,
Yes.
sorry.
Well, after I spent a year with John Milley, I went to Europe first as a freelance photographer. I covered the at that time in Portugal, the Portuguese communist candidate almost won. I went to cover the Felipe González campaign to run as the prime minister for Spain, and I realized that the Portuguese communists were very, very different than the Chinese communists that I had encountered during my childhood in Fuzhou, in mainland. And then I moved on from Spain to France, spent some time in Paris. So there was this one morning, I realized all the Parisian newspaper that morning fronted with the entire front page of Chairman Mao's portrait, and I realized the great helmsman had passed away. And that's when I called my agents in New York, Robert Pledge of Contact Press Image. It's an agency that also worked with Eddie Adam, man who shot that Viet Cong pictures, Annie Leibovitz, David Burnett, and all them. So I get my first assignment to come back to China, trying to cover the Mao's funeral. And it wasn't about to be, because little did I know that with hindsight, the Chinese were about to arrest the Gang of Four. So they said no travel, no tickets, no train ticket, nothing. But in fact, thanks for that long starter trip, I end up spending almost 10 days in Guangzhou, just observing the normal people of Guangzhou, how they would spend their days right after the death of Mao. And was a great revelation looking back, because I was photographing the people on the banks of the Pearl River and so forth, going about their daily life, looking at the pictures of Mao's information, funerals, and so on. And I realized the people I saw in Guangzhou was looking very, very different than I remembered of China in the late 50s, in that Chinese people in Guangzhou, all of a sudden looks much more relaxed. As opposed when they were more relaxed, their face language, their body language, looking at the overseas Chinese, that was me, in a way that they wasn't like that before. They become much more relaxed and so forth. So I have visited from Hong Kong to China during the Cultural Revolution. And if you want to see the people looking tense towards you, you should be there to know what that means. So that week spent, little over the week spent in Guangzhou, made me feel maybe after the death of Mao, China may change. And I wasn't sure how China would change. No way to judge. And I said to myself, well, what if China would change? That the size of the country, the size of the population, if China changed, the story would be a very big story. And I said, well, if I ever come back to China, this would be the story that's worth spending time to follow. And then I made my subsequent trip in 1977. Things were beginning to change. There was first European oil painting exhibition in Shanghai, showing the oil painting of the nude painting. I said, this is looking very much not like the China I remember. I remember that time I also shot some film, and it was my first film used by Ted Koppel on ABC News.
Nightline.
No, at that time he was ABC News. He didn't start at Nightline yet. So in '78, I went back to New York, and colleague Richard Bernstein, at that time he was the Time bureau chief in Hong Kong. He was back in New York, and the New York picture editor introduced us together. And Richard said, oh, if we ever go back to China, I want to work with HS. So we did. We were allowed to go back to China, to Beijing, to prepare to open the bureau. And in '78, practically half of the U.S. Congress and the Senate people will be coming through. You saw the pictures of the sixth garrison commander of China, sit together, chit-chat, waiting actually for Harold Brown, the first American Secretary of Defense visit to the Great Hall of People. And those how it started of our coverage of China. We were very much welcome. We have a lot of access to officials, to visit lots of places, and that's how it began.
Yeah, but in those early days when you were going to China, and China was still what we considered closed, it wasn't largely open for tourists and others to go in, you captured some of the just most interesting parts of just ordinary life. obviously the one that many remember are the students studying under the street lamps at Tiananmen Square. But when you were there at the time, how easy was it to take photos? I mean, here's an overseas Chinese walking around with big cameras at the time. You didn't have iPhones, right? What did people think of you going around taking photos? Did they know what you were doing? Did you have to explain why you were taking their photos?
I think those were the very memorable time that is what I saw, what I hear, and what I encounter said as much about the Chinese as it said about me going about my job. Mm-hmm. By that I meant we arrived early on. Mm-hmm. There was this democracy war, mm-hmm. and we would go and check the new big character poster coming up on the wall. Mm-hmm. I remember Graham Earnshaw of Reuters and I, who was a fluent Chinese speaker, mm-hmm. and we would always meet at the democracy wall. Mm-hmm. He went to check the new poster. Mm-hmm. I went to photograph, and mm-hmm. so on. And then the Chinese will bring their, pamphlets that they print, mimeograph at home, mm-hmm. and then they will sell those like Jin Tian. Mm-hmm. The man actually is now Beidao, is in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. They will sell this publication. So China After Mao, which became my book, my first book, came out in 1983, documents how Chinese is moving away, mm-hmm. Under the shadow of Mao, mm-hmm. of the previous over 3 decades. Mm-hmm. And it makes me feel that even to this day, that if we don't understand the People's Republic of China in the first 30 years, mm-hmm. it's very difficult to make sense of the second 30 years. Mm-hmm. Because those who have seen and watched the Chinese, in my case, not continuously, but with some daily life experience, you realize that my school yards will have big banner posters said in 15 years we want to catch up with the Great Britain. In 20 years we want to catch up with the United States. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, in the house where I live, I see people, their faces were blowing up, their arms were swollen from malnutrition. Mm-hmm. I was fine because my father in Hong Kong would send us money, so we would get this coupon. We could go and buy cooking oil and so on. So if you live in China in that period, mm-hmm. leading up to this great disaster of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, mm-hmm. which unofficially accounted for 43 million deaths of famine. Mm-hmm. And I saw famine mm-hmm. even in my own house, mm-hmm. which was kind of taken over by the state, my mother's house, mm-hmm. and then the neighborhood committee women would move in with other family, and I watched how they live, mm-hmm. and so forth. So I think how people feel there was this missed opportunity for education. Mm-hmm. They were sent down to the countryside. Mm-hmm. So suddenly 78 comes along, mm-hmm. and people say, "Oh, you can move about." Mm-hmm. In fact, in 79 and 1980, China have never published as many translated works mm-hmm. of philosophy, social science books, and so on from abroad. Mm-hmm. And that was the period we now look back as the spring of Beijing, mm-hmm. That things began to liberalize, mm-hmm. and the speed was was very, very impressive. So I think as someone from Hong Kong and educated in the U.S., I came back with certain empathy of what's going on in China. And also at that time, there weren't that many people with cameras. So they kind of welcomed me. As you were saying, when you hold the camera, first you communicate before you just start shooting pictures and so on. So I find they were very welcoming. And also there is one great distinction, that is the official Chinese photographers, they believe taking pictures, because film was very expensive and rare, had to be imported. You know, films like Kodachrome, Ektachrome were very rare. So they think news is, if you go to the Great Hall of People, when they're, photographing the leaders and so on. But I very early on realized the news is in daily lives. Because subsequently I spent nearly 5 years in the former Soviet Union, where China learns a lot of things from the Russian. That if you follow the Chinese daily life, you realize how politics kind of interfere into the people's daily life. And you could pick up those signs in their daily life. And I think it offered me a very rare opportunity to use a camera that you could do political reporting rather than, because by photographing daily life, you pick up how politics intervene and how politics affect the going on of the daily lives. So that became a very, looking back that 4 or 5 years, it was very, very precious for me.
Yeah, and that's a style or philosophy that you also took to the Soviet Union, because I noticed a lot of your photos, you have Gorbachev and you have Bush and Yeltsin, but you also have daily life. You have the soldier kissing mom or girlfriend on the way off to Estonia. Yes. You really kind of got a glimpse of what it's like to live there.
Yes. I think I owe my education in photography to the Grand Masters of Life magazine. Because that year spent with John Milley on the 28th floor of Time Life building in the Rockefeller Plaza, you saw photographers like Albert Eisenstadt, you saw Lena Lee, you saw, Cartier-Bresson's agent Helen Wright showed up at John Milley's office with a box of prints. And then I realized also every day after work, John Milley would cut a slice of banana apple and place it in front of me, and he poured a shot of scotch, and he poured himself a finger or two of scotch, and he would tell me about the photograph he had pasted everywhere on the floor, on the wall, and the notion about the daily lives and how you could read a photograph rather than look at photograph. And I think they really taught me a lot, because I, even to this day, I'm convinced that Chinese photographers were partially wrong, because the news was not in the Great Hall of People or Zhongnanhai. The news is out in people's daily life, which the images is much more enduring, and it tells you much more about society and the people.
Yeah, absolutely. That photo of the students in Tiananmen Square studying under the street lamps showed you kind of the real desire to get education.
Yes, and that photograph, I've mentioned it quite a few times. You know how long was the exposures? No. Because the girls were so into studying, because they just revived the Gaokao, is to they reopened the university entrance examination, which has been lost for more than a decade during the Cultural Revolution and so on. They were all sent down to the countryside. So, and they don't have much lights at home. So Tiananmen Square had some lights. So they went and sit down and study. And I was strolling by, and I was struck by this scene. So I wanted to make sure to do this photograph that the girls in front of me, I could get the depth of field as sharp as their feet, all the way to the great leader's mausoleum and the monument of Martyr. I had to shoot like f/22, and I look at, there was the light meter. There was virtually no light. But if you want to get that far, that much depth of field. So I put my Leica camera on the floors of Tiananmen Square, and I kneeled down, and on the floor, I was photographing these girls. I said, I have no idea how much to expose this frame. And I pressed the B shutter, and I start counting. 1, 2, and 3, until I counted 23 seconds.
Oh, wow, that's a long exposure.
And this young girl, they haven't moved.
Really? Did they know you were taking the picture?
Well, I think they subconsciously find somebody there on the floor. So 23 seconds later, I said to myself, well, that's about right. So I released my finger. And can somebody turn back to that photograph, I think?
You have the Tiananmen Square photo of the girls studying under the street.
Wait, I'll get this. No, I don't know.
It's a pretty amazing, almost a signature photo of yours. Let's see if we can find that one.
How do we get back to that frame? Maybe it's not in this.
Well, maybe it's not in the group here. But I thought I saw it earlier here. Yeah.
Anyway, so I exposed that frame for 23 seconds. The longest exposure I had tried. But the picture didn't move.
Good subjects.
The only time I ever tried to do something with my camera and my shutter speed was when I photographed Gorbachev. Because that frame, I think, was there. We can look at it.
Let's see if we can get that. That one?
Right, that one. So I was telling Christine Lu last night from CNN. The day before this milestone that Gorbachev on a live broadcast with the Soviet television that he would resign and the Soviet Union will be dissolved. And the day before that day, I received a call. At that time, in my car, the mobile phone is like the size of this, right?
Not exactly mobile.
So the signal actually has to go back to New York and then come back to me. So I pick up the phone and said, HS, this is Tom Johnson, who's the chairman, CEO of CNN. He said, what are you doing the next day? And I said, how often Tom Johnson would call me and find out what I would be doing the next day? I said, oh, I'm free. What do you have in mind? He said, oh, if you're free, join me. So he asked me to come to the Spassky Gate in the Kremlin the next day. It turns out that Gorbachev had an arrangement with CNN that as soon as he resigned, he would first talk to CNN in the exclusive interview. So Tom Johnson flew all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, to lead this interview himself with Steve Hearst, the bureau chief, and a big team, and set up in a separate room in the Kremlin. And I went and I, showed up, and I realized there was no one there with a camera. There was no task official photographer, no one except me. So I sat in front of Mr. Gorbachev, that desk. I am like from here to the lady dressed in white, right? We're like this distant. And the only space I find myself is in front of this gigantic Soviet television camera, the video camera, because he was about to start a live broadcast to the whole of Soviet Union. And I said I will sit there and I will face him. And the speech began, and I realized I'm in a hot spot, right? Here is the Cold War. There was this Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Lenin, and this is about to end in front of me. What am I going to do? And the KGB guard had told me, said no pictures, because he was actually very friendly. He said, because your shutter speed, your shutter, the sound of your shutter, the whole people in the Soviet Union would hear the camera click, click, click. He said, please, no pictures. I said, fine. But even I gave him my promise that I wouldn't take a picture. I said, there's no way I'm gonna not do something here. To the moment it would be this, the end of the history, so to speak. But I also said to myself, when would be the best moment to take these pictures? I decided if I do it earlier, I will probably get arrested by the KGB guard. So I decided that the moment to do this picture is when he finished the speech and he tossed the speech down. In order to catch the paper falling, because that was the moment the Soviet Union collapsed. So coming back to the photography, and I decided to take the biggest risk in my life, and that is to shoot that frame at 30th of a second to catch the paper still moving. If this photograph blow up, you'll see that his speech was moving. But having said that, 30th of a second, if Mr. Gorbachev moved, then I will be the sinner of the world, right? I will miss the whole thing. But if I shoot it, alternatively, if I shoot it with a flash, I couldn't catch the paper moving, and it would be just a regular press conference pictures. So flash was never in the consideration. 30th of a second was my decision. And I shot this frame. The moment I clicked 30th of a second, the KGB guard gave me his fist through the tripod. And Tom Johnson was standing there looking at me, said, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm fine. In the meantime, Gorbachev decided to sign his resignation, that piece of paper. He wanted to sign it, I resigned. And he had no pen. And Tom Johnson reached in his pocket and gave him his Mont Blanc. So he signed it, and then, then he stood up, and I said, I'm not going to stay for the interview. I had a picture to file.
Yes.
So I decided to leave the room in the Kremlin, and the KGB guy said, no, you come here for something else. Now you shouldn't leave because you haven't even started this interview with CNN. I said, no. I said, I gotta go. So I opened this really big, heavy door in the Kremlin, and then this red, runner carpet leading on down the hall of Kremlin, and I ran like 200 meters of the Olympic. And I went down to the end of the corner, and I turned, and hundreds of photographers and reporters were there, all giving me a middle finger. They said there was no way H.S. Liu run out of this thing alone. And we were back there. So I kept running and running out to the Red Square. I get into my car and I saw Soviet Union's flag come down and the Russian Federation flag went up. And I get back to the bureau. I start developing the film. Until I saw Mr. Gorbachev was pin sharp, my heart was unbearable to know what I did with the 30th of a second.
You know, you've been around for so many memorable events in history. We won't have time to go through all, and I do want to make sure we get a couple questions in from the audience. But you know, you were there when Margaret Thatcher was there negotiating the future of Hong Kong in Beijing. You were in India for the assassination of Indira Gandhi. You were in you covered Afghanistan. You've checked like Ukraine. You were in Korea and got tear gassed. Which one story would you like to tell us in the time we have left of all these great memorable things that you've done?
Well, I would say there were a lot of moments, obviously, but as a photojournalist, I think you realize you can never really, no matter how great one frame is and how that frame could become our collective memory, but to tell a story like the former Soviet Union, the Russia or India and China, I think we have to let it's very much like writers, right? You could let 20 most memorable interviews. You know, I remember when David Remnick did his book, and he put all those interviews together.
Yeah, Lenin's Tomb.
No, that was the nonfiction book.
Oh yes.
Before we were working together in Moscow, but he went back to become the editor of New York.
Correct, yeah.
He did a book called The Devil's Problem.
Yes.
So it's interviews. I feel for photographer, we work the same way. You really have to let the images one by one, and then you form a much more layered story of a country, of a people. So that's how I feel. But obviously, the rise of China is a story remains to this day. And even the Soviet Union collapse and the Ukraine and so on, we know very much is still the story. So I feel very much fortunate to cover these two more important story for a long period.
Very fortunate. Any questions from anyone here, or any photographers here who want tips on how to do these long exposure stories? I'm just waiting to see if I see a hand. If not, I will ask another question here about the talk. You were there for when Margaret Thatcher was there, and they're negotiating the future of Hong Kong. Now here we are, 25 years after the handover in Hong Kong. I mean, what were you thinking then as a Hong Konger? What do you think now?
You know, actually, that negotiation for the future of Hong Kong had gone on for a couple of years. I think Thatcher didn't arrive much later to sign the joint communique. The effort, the negotiation was led by the ambassador, Sir Percy Cradock, who, in his memoir, he said, what was his exact quote? He said, China is a long memory. Much of it is bitter. My experience of covering the negotiation as someone who born in Hong Kong, so the story was also very close to me personally. But one thing I felt very, very surprised, because a lot of very senior writers, journalists, and editors from Hong Kong newspaper, they were also sent sent up to Beijing to cover the negotiation. And they say, oh, there is a Hong Kong Chinese here in Beijing. Let's look him up. That was me. And in listening to their comment and story, I was very surprised. They felt that the negotiation would go, the outcome would go the British way, because the British had more cards in their hand. And that was the biggest surprise for people in journalism to make this very significant fundamental judgment that is, I would say, off the mark.
Sort of misjudgment there.
Yes.
Interesting. Anybody have any questions? Yes. Wait for the microphone here.
You know, today everybody is a photographer, everybody has a camera, everybody can get their photograph out to the world. You know, 13-year-old kids are the most popular social media photographers. Is there a role? Are you the last of the generation of great old school photographers?
I think I am an old school photographer, but I think we are irreplaceable. By that I mean, I saw a study, a survey, as far back as 2016. You could Google it if you want. I think the mankind had taken in 2016 something like 1.6 trillion plus images.
Wow, mostly food.
Right, the dinner, the flowers, the holidays, and so on, and that number had nearly doubled every year. So I don't know what is the latest number, how many pictures, mankind took collectively. So of trillions of pictures taken, I still believe that a studied approach to photography is still irreplaceable. Either is a portrait, or either is as a street photography to capture a moment, a studied moment that cannot easily be replaced.
Yeah, good point. How many of those trillions of images are actually memorable, like some of the ones that you have here? That's the thing.
Yeah, but there is we have to admit that the traditional media had taken a hit, right? So even though we would go on in a story, especially a big story, to think about a single frame that will front the New York Times next morning. Today, even though that front page picture is still published day after day, but so much of it is now offered by the traditional media that when you go to the website, which how most people access the news, then you have photography, gallery, video, and so on and so forth. So in some way, even the most recent Ukraine war and the conflict, for the first month, virtually the front page is dominated by those pictures. But in general, when you look at those images in the photo gallery, and the time to do it and so forth, that's when I comment the start of our conversation, how social media kind of expedites everything. And whereas all of us here, when we look back at the coverage of Vietnam War, and we go downstairs, we still see Nick Wood's pictures, Hugh Van Ass pictures. There's the single pictures in the newspaper or the magazine still constitute our collective memory. So fast forward to Iraq War, to the conflict and so on later on. I think our recollection and the memory become much more fuzzy because there was so much more, and they are good images.
But there's no single unifying image of things like the napalm picture from Vietnam or the police commander shooting the Viet Cong suspect. Those are things that are seared in your memory because they were single images that everybody around the world saw.
Yeah. Also, in those days, when the golden eras of traditional media, either it's Time Magazine or the Washington Post, the New York Times, the editors kind of go around and they see the same images, even though they have a photographer in the field, but they still move by the most important, most interesting photographs. And that really is the one that go into print. And then that prints in that paper, in the magazine, get distributed around the world over and over again, and then get picked up by books and publishing and so on. So when we think about back in those periods, those were the images that we still have. And today, because these images just exploded in numbers, and I think today, in some way, people go to a museum to look at an exhibition, and museum and photography and so on find itself a new role, because out of that trillions pictures, how many photographers and how much work can then go into a museum wall. And so the role of art institution to present images is, in some way has become much more important.
Okay, and seeing no more questions. Oh, one last question here and we're getting at our time limit, I'm afraid. Please.
Quick question, kind of technical. What would be your advice to a layman who happens upon a situation that they want to capture properly on a camera?
A what?
What would be your advice to a layman or layperson who happens upon a situation that they would like to capture on camera using nothing more than, say, a cell phone?
I have to admit, you can do it better than a cell phone. I remember there was one year I was in a jury. The picture was awarded to a single images, and it was taken simply by someone in the car, and the car, get off the road and plunge into a ditch on the side of the highway, and then this mud just splashed up against the window, and with that chaos of the mud on the window, there was a bud on the window, and that guy just shot, and that picture became the picture of the year. So I'm not saying that's happening a lot, but in a most unexpected way, that instantaneous, you just grab and snap is really quite extraordinary. Yeah.
So your advice is to point and shoot?
I wouldn't put it that way. Yeah.
Well, the book is The World Is Not Like This. I think there's some for sale over there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, please go and help my publisher here.
Go help the publisher, and will you stick around to sign them if people are buying?
Yes, I would be happy
That's
to.
it. You got a signed copy right here. Summer's coming up. Great gifts to anyone who loves photography or wants to know anything about the world for the last century. It's in here.
Keith, I'm not that old, but I'm old enough.
Waiting for the next book. Thank you very much, Liu Heung Shing.
Thank you.
And you've been an FCC member for I think 30 years or so, right? So,
Something like that.
so you probably already got everything we can give you, but we still give you a gift back for coming to
thank
speak.
you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for coming. See you at the next luncheon event.